Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery, to our Sutta study this morning with Bhante Suddhaso. Hello to our friends online, Michael, Gita, Angela, Jens, Kumu, Ron, Venerable Vimalanyani. Good to see you, Venerable. We are very much looking forward to visiting Empty Cloud soon, hopefully. And also Gita seconds that. Wonderful to see you, Venerable Vimalanyani. And hello to Kyle and Amaranta. And of course, good morning to Bhante Suddhaso, who will be sharing Dhamma today. So there's a link in the live chat where you can see the translation. And it will be the translation of Tissa, the Brahma Sutta, Anguttara Nikaya 756. So without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante Suddhaso so we can start this morning's sutta.
Thank you. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned this morning, we'll be going through the Tissa Brahma Sutta, so Anguttara Nikaya chapter 7, sutta number 56. Which is translated here as nothing remaining, which is not actually the name of the sutta. The name of the sutta just is the Brahma named Tissa, so the discourse to the Brahma named Tissa. But the theme of the sutta is about nothing remaining and what it means when a practitioner has nothing remaining. So as usual, I'll read through the discourse and periodically I'll stop to give some explanations. Then at the end, I'll take whatever questions you might have. So I'll go ahead and begin. The sutta starts. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the fortunate one was living at Rajagaha at Vulture Peak Mountain. Then late at night, two angels of extreme beauty illuminated all of Vulture Peak, approached the fortunate one, paid respects to him, and stood to one side. While standing to one side, one angel said to the fortunate one, Bhante, those bhikkhunis are liberated. The other angel said to the fortunate one, Bhante, those bhikkhunis are well liberated with nothing remaining. This is what those angels said. The teacher approved. Then those angels, thinking the teacher approved, paid respects to the fortunate one, and having done what was appropriate, vanished right there. So this first section here is setting the scene. So the scene here is that the Buddha is up late at night, and two devas, so two celestial beings, two angels, come to visit the Buddha. And there's many suttas where there's stories recounted of devas visiting the Buddha late at night. Sometimes they come to ask questions, or sometimes they come to explain their perspective on Dhamma and to see if the Buddha is going to correct them or approve of them. And sometimes they come to report things to the Buddha, such as when they see that a certain monastic has passed away or a certain monastic has attained a stage of awakening. Sometimes the devas will come in and talk to the Buddha about what they've seen. So of course the Buddha, if he directs his mind towards knowing the state of any particular being, he can know the state of that being. But elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha says that he doesn't know everything at all times, but it's only when he points his mind towards something that he knows it. So sometimes there's the implication that the first time the Buddha hears about something in particular is when a deva comes and reports it to the Buddha. And then the Buddha points his mind towards knowing it and confirms whatever report he's been given. So on this occasion, these two devas are reporting that some bhikkhunis have attained awakening. And one of them says that those particular bhikkhunis have nothing remaining. So there's no defilements left over. So this means they've attained full awakening, complete enlightenment. And it says here, the teacher approved. So in the suttas, the word teacher often is used to refer specifically to the Buddha, as Ayasoma pointed out yesterday. So when it's translated into English, it's commonly written with a capital T. So lowercase t is just any teacher. Capital T teacher is usually the Buddha. So it says here, the teacher approved. In other words, the Buddha confirmed what the devas were saying. He confirmed, yes, you're right. Those bhikkhunis attained full awakening with nothing remaining. So the devas disappear. Then the sutta continues. Then after the night had ended, the fortunate one addressed the monks. Monks, late last night, two angels of extreme beauty, and he reports the conversation with the devas. And then the sutta says, on this occasion, Venerable Mahamoggallana was seated not far from the fortunate one. He thought, which angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining? So Venerable Mahamoggallana was the foremost of the bhikkhu disciples who had great psychic powers. So there's several suttas of Mahamoggallana visiting deva worlds and having conversations with devas and brahmas and performing various feats of psychic power. And there's also some discourses of Venerable Mahamoggallana giving Dhamma teachings. It's a very profound Dhamma teachings. On this occasion, he has this curiosity. He's like, well, what kind of devas have the ability to know when somebody is fully enlightened and which don't have this ability? So it's important to keep in mind that the devas, so the celestial beings, although they have much more pleasant lives than humans, much more peaceful lives than humans, they don't necessarily have more wisdom than humans. They don't necessarily have any better understanding of the nature of reality than humans. And in fact, most devas still have defilements. They still are unenlightened. They're still caught in the cycle of samsara. But there are a handful of devas who are practitioners of Buddhism, and some devas who have some degree of understanding of what awakening is. And there's even a handful of devas who have attained some stages of awakening themselves, either in past lives or in their current life as devas. So the sutta continues. At that time, a monk named Tissa had recently died and reappeared in a certain Brahma world. There they knew him in this way. Tissa the Brahma has great power and great authority. Then, just as a strong person might extend a contracted arm or contract an extended arm, Venerable Mahamoggallana vanished from Vulture Peak Mountain and manifested in that Brahma world. Tissa the Brahma saw Venerable Mahamoggallana coming from afar and said to him, "Come, Sir Moggallana. Welcome, Sir Moggallana. Sir Moggallana, it has been a long time since you last came here. Sit, Sir Moggallana. This is the designated seat." Venerable Mahamoggallana sat on the designated seat. Tissa the Brahma paid respects to Venerable Mahamoggallana and sat to one side. When Tissa the Brahma was seated to one side, Venerable Mahamoggallana said to him, "Tissa, which angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining?" And Tissa replies, "Sir Moggallana, Brahma group angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining." So just to recap what's going on here. So there was this monk named Tissa who had passed away and been reborn as a Brahma. So the fact that he was reborn as a Brahma indicates that he was not himself fully enlightened. He may have had some stage of awakening but it's actually not clearly stated in the sutta. It's not clearly stated whether or not Tissa was a stream enterer or a once returner or a non-returner. All we know for sure is that he used to be a monk, and there was some kind of powerful karma acting which led to him being reborn as a Brahma. Elsewhere in the suttas, being reborn as a Brahma is usually connected with either developing very strong Brahmavihara meditation, so loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity, or with developing jhanas, so states of deep samadhi, deep concentration. So the implication here is that Tissa had some kind of very powerful meditation practice, but that not to the point of attaining enlightenment. And so here he's saying that Brahma gods, so the devas of the Brahma category, are capable of knowing which humans are fully enlightened and which still have some defilements and delusions left over. But Moggallana is not convinced. Moggallana, being fully enlightened, knows that there's a bit more to the story than that. He knows it's not sufficient just to say that the Brahma gods know who's enlightened and who isn't, that there's more to it than that. So he presses Tissa a bit further. He says, Tissa, do all Brahma group angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining? So he's saying, do all Brahma gods know this? Or just some of them? And Tissa replies, Sir Moggallana, not all Brahma group angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. Sir Moggallana, there are Brahma group angels who are content with divine vitality, divine beauty, divine pleasure, divine glory, and divine power, and who do not accurately understand that there is a further escape. They do not know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. And, Sir Moggallana, there are Brahma group angels who are not content with divine vitality, divine beauty, divine pleasure, divine glory, and divine power, and who accurately understand that there is a further escape. They know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. So here Tissa is giving a bit more detailed of an answer. So he's dividing the Brahma angels into two categories. So there are those who are content with the pleasant life of being a high-ranking deva. So having divine vitality, beauty, pleasure, glory, and power. In other words, they're just fully enraptured, enamored, completely absorbed and obsessed with their pleasant rebirth as a deva. They're just completely focused on the refined sensuality of being a deva. So in the suttas, it's the message that comes forward is that being a deva is actually not that dramatically different from being a human. It's just much more refined, much more pleasant. There's a lot less pain, a lot less suffering, but it's still just a temporary state of experience, which is characterized by attachment. It's characterized by grasping and obsession, which means that there's still a subtle undertone of dukkha. Even in the highest of the Brahma worlds, there's still dukkha. There's still that subtle dukkha of attachment to that which is impermanent. The subtle dukkha of identifying as being a particular person. The subtle dukkha of not fully understanding the nature of reality. The subtle dukkha of persistent defilements in the mind. So he's saying there are these Brahmas who they're just fixated on the pleasantness of their very enjoyable heavenly life. And they don't realize that there is a higher state of being. They think they've reached the highest state of being. They think they've reached the best that there is. And they don't realize that there is an escape from this as well. They don't realize that it's possible to attain complete freedom from suffering, to reach unconditional happiness, perfect wisdom. So they're content with an inferior form of attainment. Again, throughout the suttas, it's also made clear that if one becomes a Brahma, again, it's very pleasant, very enjoyable, very peaceful life, and it lasts a very long time, but eventually it comes to an end. And if one has not developed liberating wisdom, then they will fall to a lower state of being. They might be reborn as a lesser deva, or as a human, or as an animal, or as a ghost, or in hell. So it's not a place of safety. The Brahma worlds are not a place of safety. They're just another temporary station in the cycle of suffering. So then he talks about a second category of Brahma angels, which are those who are not content with divine vitality, beauty, pleasure, glory, and power. So in other words, these are ones who recognize that although they have a very pleasant life, a heavenly life, they recognize that it's not complete freedom from suffering. They recognize that there's still a subtle tone of dukkha that runs through even the Brahma worlds. And they realize that there is something higher, which is the attainment of awakening. There is the possibility of enlightenment. And recognizing that as long as one is obsessed with and attached with pleasurable experiences, even the most refined and subtle forms of pleasure, as found in the Brahma worlds, then one will never be free of suffering. And it's only through relinquishing one's attachment to even the most refined forms of pleasure that enlightenment becomes possible, that awakening comes within our grasp. So Tissa says, those are the kinds of Brahma devas, those are the kinds of celestial beings that do know the difference between an awakened being and an unawakened being. The difference between somebody partially liberated and somebody fully liberated. The difference, as the terminology is used in the sutta, the difference between someone with something remaining, so some defilements left over, and someone with nothing remaining, somebody who's completely purified their mind and attained full enlightenment. So then next here he goes through, Tissa the Brahma goes through a series of specific examples. So this is a bit repetitive, as we find throughout the suttas. And if you're familiar with the suttas, then the repetition will feel soothing, like a cool glass of water. If you're not familiar with the suttas, it might feel a bit frustrating. In that case, you can look at your frustration. So Tissa continues. Sir Moggallana, there is a case where a monk is doubly liberated. Those angels know it like this. That venerable is doubly liberated. As long as their body persists, they can be seen by angels and humans. After their body dies, they will not be seen by angels and humans. Sir Moggallana, in this way, those angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. So this is the first case. This is somebody who is what's called doubly liberated, or liberated in two ways. It's also sometimes translated. So this is somebody who has both attained full enlightenment, so freedom from all defilements and delusions. So that's true liberation. And also they have attained very high stages of samadhi. So this is somebody who has attained all four jhanas and also into the formless attainments. So the experience of infinite space, infinite consciousness, the experience of nothingness, and the experience of neither perception nor non-perception. So that's the other form of liberation, is the temporary liberation of states of mind in which one is, through samadhi, one is free from the ordinary suffering of having a body, the ordinary suffering of interacting with sankharas, interacting with conditional phenomena. So this is somebody who both has fully developed wisdom in the sense that they've attained enlightenment, and also the highest degree of samadhi, in that they've attained all of the samadhi states up through the formless attainments. And this is interesting because elsewhere in the suttas, it's made clear that it's not necessary to attain the formless samadhis in order to reach enlightenment. it does appear to be necessary to get some degree of jhana, though this has been debated over the centuries. But it does not appear to be necessary to attain the formless attainments, which is why there's a distinction between the doubly liberated monk and the next category. So then Tissa gives the next one. He says, Sir Moggallana, there is a case where a monk is wisdom liberated. Those angels know it like this, that venerable is wisdom liberated. As long as their body persists, they can be seen by angels and humans. After their body dies, they will not be seen by angels and humans. So this is also somebody who is fully enlightened, but who has not reached the highest development of samadhi. So they haven't reached the highest levels of the formless attainments. So here this indicates again that it's not necessarily a requirement to develop the deepest stages of samadhi in order to attain awakening. Though as I just mentioned, it does appear to be necessary to have at least some degree of jhana practice. The other important statement that's made through both of these first two is it says, as long as their body persists, they can be seen by angels and humans. After their body dies, they will not be seen by angels and humans. So this is an important statement, and it touches on a running theme throughout the suttas, which is the question of what happens when a fully awakened being passes away. So the body dies, but then what? And this is a question which the Buddha normally refuses to answer, the question of what happens to an awakened being when they die. Normally, the Buddha does not answer this question. And he says the reason he doesn't answer this question is because, one, it's completely useless to answer this question. Two, it's completely useless to ponder this question. And three, you could ponder this question for centuries and never come to a satisfactory answer. So normally he just sets aside this question, what happens to an awakened being when they die? He says, this is a question to be set aside, a question to not be answered. So people will say, well, do they continue to exist in some way? And the Buddha says, well, that's just not a valid question. And people say, well, does an enlightened being cease to exist when they die? And the Buddha says, oh, that's not a valid question. So then people start trying to get clever and they say, well, do they both exist and not exist when they die? And the Buddha says, well, that's not a valid question either. And then they ask, well, do they neither exist nor not exist when they die? And the Buddha says, that's still not a valid question. And usually he stops there, but there's a couple places where the Buddha goes one step further and he says, the concepts of existence and non-existence do not apply. So when a fully awakened being, when the body of a fully awakened being passes away, you cannot speak of them in terms of existence or non-existence. The language doesn't make sense at that point. You're trying to apply an irrelevant concept. Doesn't apply. So you can say that you can no longer see an awakened being in the sense that there is no longer any conditional phenomenon. There's no longer any sankhara anywhere in the universe. There's no longer any sankhara which is that person. There's no longer a body or a mind which you can find and point to and say, this body is that awakened being. That mind is that awakened being. You just can't find such things anymore. But that's not the same as saying that that being doesn't exist anymore. So this is the subtle distinction, which is why Tissa the Brahma is using this slightly unusual statement of just saying that after their body dies, they will not be seen by angels and humans. He's communicating the fact that they're no longer stuck in samsara. They're no longer stuck with any particular object, any particular body or mind. But he's completely stepping around the whole question of whether or not they continue to exist. Then he goes into the case of people who are not fully enlightened. And here again, he gives several examples. So next one, he says, Sir Moggallana, there is a case where a monk is a body witness. Those angels know it like this. That venerable is a body witness. if that venerable uses suitable dwellings, associates with good friends, and controls their faculties, then in this very life they may attain and dwell in the supreme goal of the spiritual life, for the sake of which people leave behind lay life and become homeless renunciants. Sir Moggallana, in this way those angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. So body witness is a term that refers to somebody who has very strong samadhi, but who has not yet attained awakening. Again, this is somebody who, at a minimum, they've attained jhanas, so very strong states of concentration, and possibly have attained the formless attainments as well. So body witness is a very literal translation of the Pali term. The Pali is kaya sakki. So kaya means body. Sakki means witness. And literally it means with one's own eyes. So sa means with, and akki means eye. So sakki means someone who sees it with their own eyes. In other words, somebody who's directly experienced it. So kaya sakki means with this very body and mind, they've directly experienced very deep states of samadhi. But of course, samadhi itself is not enlightenment. It can feel like it because for a short period of time, the mind feels very pure, very peaceful, very clear. And sometimes people attain deep states of samadhi and think that they're enlightened. But then as the samadhi fades, because samadhi states are conditional and impermanent, which means they're subject to changing, to fading. When their samadhi fades, then their defilements start to resurface. And that's when it usually becomes clear that they've not actually attained enlightenment. They just had a temporary samadhi state. So somebody can have very strong samadhi and not be fully enlightened yet, which is why here Tissa says, if they use the proper dwelling places, so living somewhere that's supportive to spiritual practice, associate with good friends, that's kalyana mitta. So good friend is kind of a weak translation. Kalyana mitta means a spiritual friend, somebody who has very wholesome qualities and who encourages you to develop very wholesome qualities. And in fact, the term kalyana mitta is commonly used to refer to your spiritual teachers. So not just like your buddy who you hang out with on the weekends, but usually it refers to somebody who helps you become a better Buddhist practitioner. So the best kind of friend is somebody who helps you to make progress on the path to awakening. Controlling their faculties means restraining our senses. So normally whenever we sense something pleasant, we have this strong impulse, this strong urge to immediately turn our attention towards it. And whenever we sense something unpleasant, we have a strong urge to pull away from it. And whenever we sense something neutral, we have a strong urge to ignore it. So controlling our faculties means that we make a strong effort to not habitually turn towards the pleasant, to not habitually recoil from the unpleasant, and to pay full attention to the neutral, as well as to the pleasant and unpleasant. So in this way, we're starting to break down our defilements. And through cultivating direct attention to the neutral, we're also cultivating wisdom. And elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha also says that one who fully understands pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral has nothing more to do. In other words, if we can understand our reactive tendencies towards pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations and conquer those tendencies, then we can attain full enlightenment just in that way. So controlling one's sense faculties is a very central part of Buddhist practice, a critical element of the path to awakening. So Tissa here, he says, if this venerable, based on their strong samadhi of being a body witness, if they then have good supportive conditions in the rest of their life, so maybe living in a monastery or living in a cabin in the woods, they have good friends who help them practice Buddhism well, and they make a strong effort to control their sensory impulses, then it's possible that they can attain awakening in this very life. Then he gives 3 more circumstances. So he says, Sir Moggallana, this is a case where a monk is a view attainer, and he goes through the same thing of if they get the right dwellings and friends and so on, then they can attain awakening. Then one who is faith liberated, and one who is a Dhamma follower. So these are 3 categories of people who are very solidly on the path to awakening. So a view attainer, so in Pali that's dittipatta, means somebody who has attained right view, somebody who has a solid, clear, unmistakable understanding of what the Dhamma is. And usually this term is used to refer to a stream enterer, somebody who's attained the first stage of awakening. So prior to stream entry, you can't really say that somebody has right view. You can say that they have mundane right view. If somebody studies the Dhamma and reads the suttas and really makes an effort to understand it, then they can have mundane right view, and that they get the concepts intellectually. But it's only when we directly see for ourselves that the Buddha knew what he was talking about, that one can really be said to have right view. And that's synonymous with attaining stream entry, the first stage of awakening. And there's many suttas where the Buddha defines exactly what it means to have right view. So it includes things like, at the most basic, it means direct knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, direct knowing of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path to the cessation of suffering. It also brings with it an understanding of karma and rebirth. So last night we were talking about karma. So again, a very important element of right view is understanding how all of our decisions, all of our choices are the causes of all of our experiences sooner or later. And rebirth, understanding how we cycle through different states of being based upon the choices that we make. And also sometimes the Buddha talks about right view in more subtle, mind-blowing ways. So here at the monastery, we commonly chant the Kachanagota Sutta, where the Buddha defines right view as one who does not get caught in either the belief that things exist or the belief that things don't exist. This is a very subtle way of talking about right view. So it's recognizing that things have what you might call conditional apparent existence. So things appear to exist under certain conditions. So in that case, it's not really accurate to say that they don't exist at all, but it's also not really accurate to say that they have any kind of real substantial existence to them either. So when one sees reality in this way, then the mind naturally inclines towards dispassion, towards disenchantment, naturally inclines towards letting go. And when the mind inclines towards letting go, then enlightenment is not far beyond. Enlightenment is within reach. So that's another way that the Buddha talks about right view. And realistically, I could spend the next 3 hours just talking about right view. But our time is limited, so we'll keep moving. And the next 2 cases he gives are the case of one who is faith liberated and one who is a Dhamma follower. And these 2 categories of beings are only mentioned in a handful of suttas, and they're not clearly defined. So some scholars are of the opinion that these are particular varieties of stream enterers. But that doesn't quite fit, because when they're mentioned in the suttas, they're usually mentioned as a category of people who are not yet stream enterers, but who have developed very strong practice, which means that they are bound to attain stream entry very soon. So one who is faith liberated, that's saddha vimutta, is somebody who has very strong faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. So they're absolutely convinced that the Buddha was enlightened. They're absolutely convinced that the Dhamma is an accurate description of how to attain awakening. They're absolutely convinced that those who follow the Buddha's teachings can reach the same degree of purity and wisdom that the Buddha reached. So this deep faith, this deep unshakable faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, which then the faith-liberated person is said to still be deficient in wisdom, but their faith is so strong that they are going to develop that wisdom inevitably. One who has genuine deep faith in Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha will eventually take the Dhamma seriously enough that the wisdom starts to settle in, that wisdom starts to grow in their mind. And the other example is the Dhamma follower, so Dhammanusari. So the Dhamma follower, on the other hand, is somebody who maybe their faith is not so great just yet, but they have some intellectual understanding of the Dhamma. They really get it. When they read the suttas, they understand what the suttas are talking about. When they listen to a Dhamma talk, they know what the person's talking about. They have a strong connection, a strong enthusiasm for learning the Dhamma, and contemplating the Dhamma, and discussing the Dhamma. So the Dhamma follower is somebody whose wisdom faculty is very strongly developed. And when one's wisdom faculty is strongly developed, then it's natural that faith will start to arise. It's natural that they'll start to get deep confidence in the wisdom of the Buddha, and in the wisdom of the Dhamma, and in the capacity of the Sangha to produce awakened beings. So both the faith-liberated person and the Dhamma follower person both have the necessary conditions to attain awakening once they work on building up their weak sides a bit more. So again, in these cases, Tissa says if they have the right conditions, so the right place to live and practice, the right supportive spiritual companions, and they work on controlling their minds, then they can attain awakening in this life. So the sutta continues. Then, after delighting in and rejoicing in Tissa the Brahma's statement, just as a strong person might extend a contracted arm or contract an extended arm, Venerable Mahamoggallana vanished from that Brahma world and manifested at Vulture Peak Mountain. So he teleports back to the Buddha. He approached the Fortunate One, paid respects to him, sat to one side, and reported to the Fortunate One the entire conversation with Tissa the Brahma. And the Buddha replies, Moggallana, Tissa the Brahma did not teach you about the seventh kind of person, the one who dwells in objectlessness. This is where the sutta gets really exciting for me. So objectlessness is animitta. So animitta vihari, one who dwells in objectlessness. So in a number of suttas, the Buddha refers to animitta samadhi. So objectless samadhi, concentration with no object, nothing that the mind is fixating on or focusing on. So this is a relatively difficult and advanced form of meditation practice, where one is not focusing on any object in particular, but rather actively letting go of all objects that appear, actively letting go of all sankharas. So this is corresponds to the practices which are commonly known in the Chan tradition, the Zen tradition, silent illumination meditation, shikantaza meditation, the practices of letting go of all phenomena. So not fixating on anything in particular, but rather not letting the mind stick to anything that appears. So this is a practice of simultaneous samadhi and vipassana. So this both brings a great stillness and peacefulness to the mind, and it also leads to the relinquishing of all phenomena, which is the path to liberation. So animitta samadhi is a form of simultaneous samatha vipassana practice that can lead all the way to full awakening. However, it's phenomenally difficult. So in the Theravada tradition, it's not normally recommended for beginners. Sometimes, but not normally. Normally, it's a practice that you might pick up after many years of practicing object-based samadhi. and object-based vipassana. So object-based samadhi is like mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of breathing, loving kindness meditation, things where you have a solid object that you focus on in order to stabilize the mind. And object-based insight meditation is, again, things like contemplation of the 6 elements or the recognition of impermanence, contemplation of not-self, where you have a particular theme or idea that you're focusing the mind on, a particular lens through which you're viewing experience in order to help the mind let go of the delusion of permanence and the delusion of self-existence. So after one has some familiarity with object-based samadhi and object-based vipassana, then it becomes easier to practice objectless meditation, objectless samadhi, which, as I mentioned earlier, is simultaneous samatha vipassana, simultaneous serenity and insight. So the Buddha is bringing in this 7th kind of person. So this is a very subtle form of meditation, which might be why Tissa the Brahma didn't talk about it. It might be that this was outside the domain of Tissa the Brahma's knowledge, that Tissa the Brahma was aware of more ordinary states of practice, states of mind, but he wasn't aware of this very refined and subtle state of being. Or it's possible that Tissa the Brahma just omitted it for his own reasons. Again, although it's not specifically stated in the sutta, the impression I get from the sutta is that Tissa the Brahma was not yet enlightened. So he was familiar with Buddhist practice, deeply familiar with Buddhist practice, but he himself still had some degree of defilement or delusion remaining. So his vision of the Dhamma was still a little hazy, a little incomplete. So the Buddha is completing the picture here. So Moggallana says, "Now is the time, fortunate one. Now is the time, sublime one. May the fortunate one teach about the 7th kind of person, the one who dwells in objectlessness. The monks will listen to the fortunate one and remember." Venerable Mahamoggallana replied to the fortunate one. The fortunate one said this, "Hear, Moggallana, by not paying attention to any objects, a monk attains and dwells in the objectless unification of mind." So again, that's animitta samadhi, objectless unification of mind. So here the Buddha actually gives a slightly longer statement. He says, animittang ceto samadhi. So normally he just says animitta samadhi. Here he says animitta ceto samadhi. So ceto means mind. So still has the same overall meaning. So objectless samadhi, objectless unification of mind. And he gives this statement that the way one reaches this is by not paying attention to any objects. So not fixating on any sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, or thought, but just constantly letting go of every object that appears. But, very important point, not letting go of your attention, not letting go of your awakeness, your alertness. Because if you let go of your alertness, then you'll just fall asleep, and that's not objectless samadhi, that's just sleeping. It's not so useful. I've known a lot of people who thought they were practicing objectless samadhi, but they were actually just practicing sleepiness, which, I mean, if you're tired, that's fine, I suppose, but it's not very productive. I spent many years practicing objectless sleepiness, and that was not so productive. Nowadays, I drink oolong tea, and life has gotten a little bit sharper. So. Anyway, so the Buddha says, those angels know it like this, that Venerable attains and dwells in the objectlessness unification of mind. So again, animitta ceto samadhi. If that Venerable uses suitable dwellings, associates with good friends, and controls their faculties, then in this very life they may attain and dwell in the supreme goal of the spiritual life, for the sake of which people leave behind lay life and become homeless renunciants. Sir Moggallana, in this way those angels know when someone has something remaining and when someone has nothing remaining. So that's the end of the sutta. I find it quite interesting here that the Buddha puts somebody who's fixated on animitta samadhi in the same category as the faith follower and the Dhamma follower. So somebody who has a very advanced practice, but has not yet attained awakening. And they just need the right supportive conditions in order for them to make that final breakthrough. So that's the end of this discourse. At this time, we have a few minutes for questions. So if there's any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Hannamayam nammakataya sadhukatam nadamase. Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Thank you very much, Bhante, for sharing with us that beautiful sutta. As Gita says, so much Dhamma Sukha. I think we all share those thoughts. And hello to more friends who have joined us in the meanwhile. Hello to Cam, Tara, good to see you. Rohini, Putrika, Pratibha, Marielle, good to see you. And Olga, Walker, Sunny, hello Sunny, Pearly, Anita, and Elaine. Ajahn Stan, our resident monastic active, found a parcel. So I believe you will be opening it today. So thank you, Elaine, on behalf of Ajahn Stan. And so if you have any questions, feel free to type them in and we'll pass them on to Bhante. In the meanwhile, Michael is asking, may we say that the Brahma world is a place of opportunity and that life is long and conditions are pleasant? Yet how does one progress when no challenges are put to one? Human world is the best?
Yeah, I'd be hesitant to call the Brahma world a place of opportunity. I get the impression I get from the suttas is that the Brahma world is more a place of indolence, of laziness. As with most of the deva worlds, but actually the higher up you go in the deva worlds, the more the mind seems to incline towards laziness. Like there's no problems. Life is great. You can have a great time just sitting around doing nothing. So why bother doing anything? The higher Brahma worlds are described as being like being in very strong samadhi all the time. So you're just having a really, really pleasant, peaceful time all the time, no matter what. But your defilements are still lurking underneath the surface. And eventually, they will remanifest. Eventually, they will reappear. It's kind of like seeds in the soil. During the winter, it looks like there's no weeds anywhere. You're like, oh, it's great. There's no weeds here. Everything, the ground is very pure and clean. No problem. But then in the spring, when the conditions are right, suddenly weeds start sprouting all over the place. You're like, well, where did all these weeds come from? And the answer is they were always there. They were just beneath the surface where you couldn't see them. So that's the problem with the deva worlds. And again, the higher up you go, the bigger the problem gets. Their lives are so pleasant and peaceful that there's very little impetus. There's very little drive to work on uprooting their defilements and cultivating liberating wisdom. It does still happen. There are accounts in the suttas of devas attaining awakening. It does happen. But again, it's difficult. The tendency is just to laze around and have a nice time. In the lower deva worlds, they like to party all the time. The higher deva worlds, they're just sitting around in samadhi all the time. And both of them eventually pass away and reappear somewhere less pleasant. So traditionally in Buddhism, we normally say that the human world has the best conditions because there's enough pain and misery and torment to kind of spur us to keep practicing. But at the same time, our conditions are pleasant enough and supportive enough that we're not so immersed in misery that we can't practice. So animals have a very hard time because it's hard for them to control their minds and they have a lot of suffering. And devas, usually they're so immersed in pleasure and happiness that they're not much interested in practicing. Humans, we have a nice balance of pleasure and pain and access to the Dhamma. and the urgency of knowing that death is just around the corner, and that we don't have a lot of time to waste. So human life is considered the best conditions for awakening.
Thank you, Bhante. And Kumu asks, what is the meaning of conveying merit to devas after, say, a meritorious act, such as offering food to the Sangha? The chanting of Akasata Chapummata.
So actually, technically, what that chant is doing is it's inviting the devas to recognize the goodness that you've done and to rejoice together with you. So, Akasata Chapummata deva nagamahidika punyang tang anumoditva. So having rejoiced together with me on account of this good deed that I've done. So anumoditva, more commonly people know the form anumodana, but it's the same verb in Pali. And then you're inviting them to protect the Buddha's teachings. So charang rakantu sasanang. So may you protect the Buddha's teachings for a long time. So technically speaking, what you're doing there is not sharing merit with the devas in the sense of like packaging up some merit and passing it to them. But rather, it's in the sense that you're inviting the devas, like, hey, come pay attention. We made some merit here, and if you pay attention and appreciate it, then you will be making merit by appreciating the merit that we've made. So appreciating somebody else's merit is itself productive of merit. So this is what we mean by sharing merit. Technically, you can't like put merit in a box and give it to someone. It doesn't work that way. What you can do is invite somebody else to make merit by appreciating your merit. Okay?
Sadhu, thank you.
Hi, Savijana.
It's just always interesting to me that this is another sutta where the bhikkhunis have attained something. The opening is that they, obtained liberation and they've, destroyed all the taints. They have nothing remaining. And then the attention goes to the devas.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. It also occurred to me that it sounded like the bhikkhunis all it simultaneously, like the devas are coming to report that these bhikkhunis had attained this. Is often when just soon after something has occurred, they come and they report it. So it's like a group of bhikkhunis simultaneously attained this.
Yeah, I mean, and we don't really know. So kind of the feeling I get with this sutta is that there's some story before the sutta begins that wasn't preserved. So there's actually many suttas where I get this feeling. I get the feeling like there was some background story which was unfortunately not passed down to us. So that's what I feel we see here. There was something going on with some bhikkhunis, but that part we don't have in the sutta, and we can only speculate. Yeah, I find the opening here interesting. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you, Venerables. And Peter is asking, can you please delineate the difference between vipassana and objectless unification of mind?
So as I mentioned earlier, as far as I can tell, objectless unification of mind is a form of vipassana meditation that also has a strong samadhi component. So in the Yogananda Sutta, the Buddha talks about 3 kinds of meditation practice, technically 4, but the 4th kind is this 2,500-year-old question mark, which maybe Ajahn Pasano can answer. He's shaking his head. So we normally just talk about the first 3 because those are more straightforward. So the first one is where you start with samadhi and then afterwards you practice vipassana. And throughout Buddhist history, that's normally been the most commonly taught approach because that seems to work pretty well for most people. The second one is where you start with vipassana and then switch to samadhi. That's a bit less common, but for some people, their mind inclines towards activity and investigation. So it's helpful for them to start with vipassana And then eventually they realize that their vipassana is really shallow because their samadhi is too weak. And then they start building up their samadhi afterwards. And the third category is simultaneously developing both samadhi and vipassana together, which is where the title of the sutta comes from. Yoganada means bound together. So this is binding together samadhi and vipassana into a single practice instead of doing them as separate practices. So animitta samadhi appears to be a yoganada practice, a practice which is simultaneous samatha vipassana. So that means, yes, it is a form of vipassana meditation, and it also is a samadhi practice. And with that particular style of meditation, those two halves cannot be separated. They're seamlessly conjoined.
Great, thank you so much, Bhante. And Vasily asks, how do I actually make sure I don't practice objectless sleepiness?
Well, again, oolong tea helps tremendously. I remember when I was living at Tassajara, so a Zen monastery that I spent a couple of years at, pretty much every single morning I would fall asleep during meditation. And at one point the abbot came up to me and he was like, "Have you considered drinking green tea?" And I was like, "I will not rely upon external supports." And he was like, "I can appreciate that, but we should be practical about these things." I still resisted for a while, but eventually I gave in to the lure of caffeine. So I do use tea. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Helps a lot. Don't be ashamed to use what's supportive. So that's one thing, is making sure that you actually do have sufficient physical support. Then there's the ordinary practices of sitting up straight, keeping your eyes open if you need to. Actually, soon in a couple of weeks, I think I'll be talking about the sutta on nodding, the Buddha's advice to Moggallana about how to not fall asleep during meditation. One practice that's actually really helpful is to use an active form of meditation, which means not doing objectless samadhi, by the way. Objectless samadhi is too peaceful. If you're prone to sleepiness, then objectless samadhi is not a good choice. It's more useful for somebody who already has a very awake mind. Actually, I find it's really good when my mind is restless. When my mind is restless, then objectless samadhi is often just what it needs. But it doesn't work well if you're prone to sleepiness. In that case, you're better off using some kind of active object-based meditation. 6 elements is actually great for that. 6 elements meditation, there's enough going on that it helps to keep you awake.
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Tamyang, did you have some comment? Okay. And Michael says, we speak of making intentions for our rebirth. We say, too, that our good karma leads us to the celestial realms. Your description is the reason I often make the intention to the human world, not to mention enlightenment.
Be careful. Be careful to specify that you want to be reborn as a human in a good family with good spiritual faculties and access to the Dhamma and access to good teachers. You don't want to just be any old human. So be clear. Be clear about the kind of human rebirth that you're aspiring towards.
Thank you, Bhante. And Anita asks, did the Brahmatissa know of the Animitta Samadhi? Like how we know but not there? Does the knowing sometimes create the desire that can take one back?
So it's not clear in the sutta here. The implication seems to be that Tissa, the Brahma, did not know about Animitta Samadhi, or perhaps he didn't consider it important enough to talk about. Again, it's not clear. This is just speculation. But it appears that was a gap in his knowledge of the Dhamma. What was the other part of the question? I didn't quite understand.
Like how we know but not there. Does the knowing sometimes create the desire that can take one back?
I don't understand.
Maybe Anita, if you can clarify, and then we can share it again with Bhante. Anita says, this sutta was very interesting. Is objectless unification another word for cessation?
No. No, I would not call that another word for cessation. But I would say that through practicing objectless samadhi, you can start to directly observe the cessation of phenomena. So it's one way of getting in touch with the contemplation of cessation, which the Buddha talks about contemplating cessation in many, many discourses. So this is one way, because naturally, as you stop clinging to objects, you stop reifying objects. And when you stop reifying objects, then they start to disappear. So animitta samadhi naturally leads to the perception of impermanence, naturally leads to the perception of emptiness. Okay?
Great, thank you, Bhante. And Kumu, Michael, and Ron are very happy about the clarifications on the transfer of merit. And Vasily asks, can Tai Chi practice be considered a form of active meditation in Buddhist terms?
I'm always hesitant to directly endorse anything that's outside of Buddhism. I will say that I know many monks who use Qigong or Tai Chi. Tai Chi, realistically, by the way, is just a subset of Qigong. It's a particular category of Qigong practice. So I know many monks who use Qigong practices of various sorts and find it supportive to their Buddhist practice. I'm a little hesitant to call it a form of active meditation. I mean, I need to be better off asking somebody who has a lot of experience with those practices. I don't have much experience. I haven't used them in years. Actually, Ajahn Pasano at least used to do Qigong. I don't know if he's still into it. Are you still into Qigong?
Actually, just the warm-ups, but I do.
Okay. Okay. So you might ask Ajahn Pasano at the end of one of his talks to talk a little bit about incorporating Qigong practices with Buddhism. Yeah, I'm not the best person to ask because I don't use those practices myself.
Great. And that was the last question, unless there are some questions here from the live in-person audience. I think that's a no. All right, so we can end this morning. We'll be meeting again this evening at 7:30 p.m. and tomorrow again at 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time with a special guest that you've heard perhaps is already in the room. So Ajahn Pasano, Bhante Suddhaso's preceptor and the direct disciple of Ajahn Chah, thanks to whom actually Empty Cloud is even in existence, since we all seem to have had a strong connection with that tradition. So lots of exciting opportunities to learn Dhamma from a senior monk of over 40 years. Is that correct, Ajahn?
That's correct, yeah.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Big inspiration. All right, so we can end the morning with 3 sadhus, and we'll see you later tonight. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.